Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Today we have a special episode where we sat down with Stephen Yates. He's an American political advisor and government official who last served as the president of Radio Free Asia. He gave his take on growing privacy concerns, especially in Hong Kong, as well as the growing Cold War between the U.S. and China. Well, hello, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to join.
So you have a lot of titles, and one of them is you served as the president of Radio Free Asia. And Radio Free Asia was based on the principles of combating communist ideology around the world. So how do you think that's been playing out?
Yeah, well, Radio Free Asia specifically is a surrogate media to try to push content into areas that don't have a free press to serve average citizen. One of the fundamentals of freedom and democracy, as well as free markets, is to have as close to perfect information as you can get. And so certainly China, North Korea, some parts of Southeast Asia don't have free press. There's two challenges with that. One is, what are the ideas that you're trying to push in? Are you trying to expose the corruption or failure to perform of the current government? Are you trying to show the positives from similar experiences outside the world that are not allowed to be broadcast in China? I'm pretty sure that there isn't a lot of accurate cultural Chinese coverage that's making its way into China. Have decisions to make about what kind of content to push into that market. That would be empowering and inspiring to the Chinese people, but also revealing and corrosive of the dictatorial approach that the Communist Party has taken and imposed upon them. But certainly more needs to be done. There are no perfect examples. And so far, in the early parts of the Biden administration, we don't have a good idea of what they're really going to do to take that kind of a service to a new level, whether it's in Asia or the Middle East or Europe. There are these big services, and also Cuba. It's unclear what they're really going to do to not just say that America is back, which is their slogan, but to really put new creativity, new resources, and a new power behind messages to empower people to expand freedom abroad.
And yeah, you mentioned free press, and it seems there's been a whole evolution and development in the tech industry. So now a lot of that information is online. So what are some of the concerns you see coming out of that?
Well, I think there's several. One is the lack of any sense of free press, free speech ethos among big tech. And so we end up with these unaccountable non-governmental entities that actually have an immense amount of control about content, but also being able to deplatform entire organizations so that you don't just block an article or an individual, but you can lose access to all of your files stored in a cloud in the flip of a switch at the whim of a committee that no one knows. And it's not really accountable to governments, people, voters, anything. So I think there's an immense concern that the internet has gone from the final frontier of freedom when it came to free speech and free content, including the freedom to be offended, to being something where there is almost complete control over content and the actions of people, and without any kind of redress. I know people that are in my family, in my circle of friends, who have been deplatformed from some of the big social media companies, and they haven't even been given an example of what their alleged offense was. And so no due process, they err on the side of censorship. And so so that's one whole category of concern. But married with that concern is the entertainment industries and big tech's interest in having access to China. And so you have everything from LinkedIn sending warnings to people that your content is no longer going to be visible in China because you wrote an article about June 4th in the 1990s. And I have friends that have received that kind of warning message, and it's from 20 plus years ago. And yet LinkedIn is bending over backwards to send this warning, and it's at the behest of the CCP. That's probably replicated in other authoritarian regimes around the world. But it's what it means is that there isn't a sense of free press, there isn't a sense of free access, and there's no accountability and redress when someone has been denied that platform. We learned from the Green Revolution in Iran that those organizers relied heavily on services like Twitter. And when they're denied access to those platforms, the government has greater ability to thwart demonstrations and organizations against them. So I think we have now a huge concern about the internet being the dominant throughway for today's media and the role that tech plays in controlling that.
So how do you see these tech platforms as kind of changing people's perception of, say, how communism operates? And then also, how do we as in America operate in response?
Well, I have to say, I'm kind of disappointed with a lot of the leading commentators in America not being more up in arms about the principles behind the First Amendment. I mean, it used to be that First Amendment advocacy, whether it was freedom of speech, freedom of religion, a number of different First Amendment related issues, there was a big overlap between Republicans and Democrats. It wasn't complete, but it was a big overlap. There was also a big overlap ideologically between conservatives and libertarians and liberals about the first principles of the First Amendment. And it wasn't the freedom to avoid offense, because if you didn't protect the offensive speech, those protections wouldn't be there for the person that needed political rights or women's rights or whatever the category was to be able to advocate. So I have to say, it's a really disappointing time to go through, where there's this totalitarian mindset that seems to be seeping in. Jonathan Turley wrote a very provocative, in a positive way, article about the new generation of intellectuals in America, including those going through law school, are kind of at the lowest point in generations for advocacy for First Amendment rights. And so he worries, as that generation comes out of law school and into being judges and attorneys and advocates, will this erosion of these principles of free speech and association kind of stay in place? And I think so. We have a significant cultural issue here. But the part that makes me optimistic is that we have entrepreneurs finding new ways to avoid big tech in order to stay online and be able to broadcast. And I think as the American public is put off by these totalitarian-like controls and explores these other avenues, and competition comes back into the tech space, I think that we'll have a greater platform from which to promote the good parts of America, but also some of this content that makes life hard for totalitarians like the Communist Party of China.
So why do you think there's kind of this erosion of standing up for the First Amendment in America?
Well, I think it's actually worthy of research to try to dig deep into what the drivers of this have been, because those of us who've kind of lived through the last decade or so where this really accelerated, we're a little bit like that frog that was slow cooked in boiling water, and we don't really remember when it started and when it got too late. But now we sort of feel like it's really, really bad. But I think among the things that happened that accelerated this was the militarization of information in American politics. And so one thing that the internet did is it liberated a lot of entrepreneurs to do a lot of really negative ads for political campaigns. And you can do sustained programming on that. You end up with your army of armchair critics that can mob anybody online. And I think there was this dehumanizing effect of social media that made people feel like it was okay to attack other human beings in ways that they would have felt embarrassed to do in the past. I think social media, in a way, has been a cancer that has eaten away at manners, at sense of community, that you can actually disagree with on politics with people and still love them and be a part of a family, part of a church, part of a community, have a real conversation. The internet combined with the social media effect, which monetizes anger, has really had a massive psychological effect. And what it's done is it's empowered the people who want to shout the loudest, and they then go off and try to shut down other people that they've decided don't deserve to speak. That, I think, has really kind of accelerated from the middle of the last decade. I think a very slippery form of logic, very immoral form of logic also. It also happens not to be true. We should still be able to treat our fellow human beings as exactly that. But I think it's the advent of anti-social media that has led to this place where big tech now is empowered to deplatform. It's mob rule in a way, but it's which mob from which geography with what money. And so when you're talking about these platforms in big tech, it's not like they're being run out of Topeka, Kansas. They're not being run out of Alabama. They're being run out of urban areas, which is very far from life connected to the earth, whether that be farming or manufacturing, very disconnected from the working class of America, which used to be the bread and butter demographic that both major parties were trying to appeal to. There were people like my dad who had grease under his fingernails from working in a car shop all the time, didn't really like politics, but sort of had an ethos about being proud about America. He might vote Republican, he might vote Democrat. These were kind of the bricks on which the country was built. But big tech and big media are housed in San Francisco and LA and New York and DC to a degree. And these are urban areas that are overwhelming liberal and Democrat, more represented in the Democratic Party by the so-called squad than they are by people like former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle from South Dakota. But I think some of it comes from this concentration of access to the platforms, access to money, and the education and technology concentration on these coastal urban areas. And so when they think among themselves what's acceptable speech and what's the right approach to things, they're so divorced from the real life of a supermajority of Americans. They can't conceive of there being a large number of states where former President Donald Trump would easily win a majority vote. For them, it's completely unthinkable. For them, the debate about race and the history of the United States, all that, it's informed by whatever their small bubble says matters. And they can go with whatever whims of their advocacy groups would propose. But for normal Americans in flyover America in the working class, they work with people of different races. That's why there are a lot of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and along with Asian Americans and white Americans that all voted in favor of tight legal immigration policies because they're all affected by illegal immigration in an unfair way. It's why they supported the idea of promoting fair trade, because the interests of free trade predominantly went to big tech and to Wall Street, and they felt left behind by this. And those elites in these sort of bubbles don't have any tie to or accountability to those people. And so if they put an extreme policy in place, the way Twitter and Facebook did in the last election, they're not subjected to voters. They're only subjected to their shareholders. And their shareholders also happen to be coastal elites in these same bubbles.
It seems like a lot of people notice on social media all the views they see align with theirs because there's a lot of algorithms that create these bubbles so that you only see what finds pleasing. So what are some ways you think people can stem these risks?
Well, I think it's extremely important for people to find new and different avenues of information. The platform on which we are speaking is something that hasn't always existed. It exists outside of the control of these other platforms in some important ways. And people can participate for themselves and see, is this an honest and even-keeled conversation with which I can agree or disagree? I think it's very, very important for people to know, number one, there is very effective and unhealthy science behind the social media networks that has monetized anger. They exist to make you uncomfortable because you're more likely to take action on their advertising after you've been made uncomfortable because you will be engaged. If you realize that and you deliberately step out of that universe to try to get other forms of unbiased, unfiltered conversation and thought, I think people will be better off, because whether they think that we're the best experts in the world, they can tell that we're having an open, honest, and thoughtful conversation, and they can make of it what they choose. And so hopefully market forces will bear out that this is the better way forward, and people can actually partake of this information and be happy instead of going to social media and becoming angry.
There's been a lot of outrage after Apple Daily was shut down in Hong Kong, and a lot of world leaders are condemning the move and saying Hong Kong's freedoms are being eroded. And so recently, Biden just extended one of former President Trump's executive orders to put sanctions on Hong Kong officials. And so how do you see all of that playing out?
Yeah, well, it's a tragedy to watch what has happened with Hong Kong because in so many ways it was unnecessary. We thought, many people, in the 1990s, when the Basic Law came into effect and PRC sovereignty was inevitable, that the promises of the Basic Law could be trusted to be implemented. You knew that Beijing wasn't going to be more liberal than was promised, but you thought that perhaps they would be at least as liberal as they had committed to in passing their own basic law from the National People's Congress. It turns out that those assumptions were entirely wrong. And many people thought for a generation that Hong Kong, being a very, very free people, free information environment, free press, free markets, massive international hub of capital and investment, that Beijing needed this too much and it wouldn't allow that privileged status to erode. But what we learned over the last 2 years is that at some point, Beijing decided they don't care. They are willing to allow Hong Kong to be downgraded from the international financial hub that it's been, that they are willing to compromise one country, two systems and make it essentially one country, one system. And Apple Daily, in some ways, I have to just give immense respect to the owner and the reporters and everyone in between at Apple Daily for their courage and commitment to see this through to the end. Because many of them had options. They could have gone to other networks. They could have gone to other places. They could have had jobs in media and other places. Jimmy Lai himself had all the resources where he could have easily gone somewhere else and lived out a good life. He instead chose to stand by the Chinese people writ large, the Hong Kong people, and the principles that animated his life and that business. And I wish that more world leaders in government, but also in entertainment, in media, in all spheres of life, would stand by these examples. Instead, I fear that too many of them will pay lip service, but then they cut their deal with the devil so that the next Top Gun can be shown in all of the theaters of China. John Cena speaking in broken Mandarin and with broken ideas about apologizing for what he said so that a Fast and Furious movie could be seen in China. So I just hope that we can cross that threshold and get back some sense of courage and humanity. I mean, remember Richard Gere standing at an award ceremony calling out the leaders of China to support freedom for the Tibetan people and human rights in China. And Hong Kong, I think, is that place where now that it's tragically where it is today, we have to think long and hard what comes next. Number one, I don't believe that the people of Hong Kong will give up, and I hope we can help them endure what they're going through. But we have to know that what's next is pressure on Taiwan, continued pressure on America, Australia, Japan, India,
Many consider like the U.S. and China to now be in a Cold War on every level of national power. And one of the main aspects that's in question right now is the issue of Taiwan. There was a magazine article in China recently that laid out a three-step plan for attacking Taiwan. So how do you see that as playing out?
Well, on the one hand, I think that leaders in China and their surrogates are saying some provocative and dangerous things, and they should not get away with that for free. And make sure that there's some kind of cost, whether it's reputation cost or economic cost or opportunity cost, some kind of cost has to be associated with irresponsible speech and threats and bluster by Chinese leaders and intellectuals, for that matter. They seek to impose costs on anyone who questions Xi Jinping thought or China's right to rise or whatever else that they want to say is, anti-China out there. For decades, they've been penalizing professors, think tank experts, people who write in the media if they engage in wrongthink. So we in the free world need to make clear that we're placing responsibility where it is. I don't support the idea that Taiwan is an issue or a problem. It's the way the American government talks about this too often, and I think that's a mistake, but it's exactly what China wants the framing of that conversation to be. No one believes that Taiwan is going to wake up one day and say, I'd like to launch preemptive missiles or nuclear weapons or some kind of a land attack on the Chinese mainland. No one rational believes that for a moment. But there are a lot of rational people that worry at some point the Communist Party could decide that they think they have an option that's viable, or that politically they feel like now is the time that they must move, that time is not on their side. And so I just think that we have to make clear that it's not Beijing versus Taipei, it's not China versus Taiwan, and it's not the US versus China. This is China Communist Party versus the free world, including the Chinese people that are at peace with the free world. But it's the Chinese Communist Party that is the provocateur, the bad actor, the responsible party in this equation that needs to bear responsibility for the risk of crisis. China has benefited from the international community and controls more United Nations subordinate organizations than the United States does at this point. Is the world better off? Is world health better because of China's dominance there? No, it's not. Is human rights better because of China's dominant role influencing the Human Rights Commission? No, it's not. And so I think it's very, very clear where the provocation and challenge is coming from. We can't let this potential threatening of Taiwan be reduced to, well, if Taiwan would just be the obedient child and not say bad words, then we can go on and pretend we have peace. The problem isn't Taiwan. The problem is Beijing.
And so for many years, the free world has been trying to get the message of democracy and those ideas into communist China. But on the flip side, communist China has been trying either equally as hard or even harder to get their ideologies here in America, especially. How successful do you think they were?
Well, they've clearly been more successful in penetrating the American academic, media, financial, and political world than America or anyone else has been in penetrating the Chinese academic, media, and financial world. We have allowed our freedom to be a potential vulnerability in giving them privileged access to try to influence us and our people and our institutions. Now, I don't think the answer to that is to have less freedom. I think the answer to that is to be smarter. And we should be challenging them on their turf more. And I think the insistence upon simple principles of reciprocity are a beginning of that approach. If we don't have equivalent access to their universities, their media, their broadcast channels, their markets, than we have given here, then I think there have to be some kind of fair trade controls put in place. If they want to abide by the rules of transparency and accounting and accountability that all of our companies and market players have to abide by, well, then maybe we can allow them to participate. But there's been a Chinese exceptionalism that was practiced in the past, where they were treated as a developing market and didn't have to abide by the same standards to play in our markets and to play in our technology and to play in our education systems. I think that is where we need to shift the middle of the conversation back to reciprocity, having the equal treatment under the law, equal standards abided by all parties in our systems. And if there are those who want to be non-status quo players in our markets and in our universities and elsewhere, then they need to pay a premium or they need to pay a penalty. So I think that's the beginning of it. But China has clearly done better in penetrating America than America has done in penetrating China. But we also don't necessarily have evil designs for the Chinese people. What's really different, and I think what's changed the most in recent years, is China has found effective ways to accelerate division in American politics and American society. And so some of what they have done through social media and social activism has been to exacerbate some of the divisions in America over race, over economic status and opportunity. They have used movements in the United States to actually become more anti-American. And so their ability to destabilize and divide America has increased in recent years, whereas the Chinese Communist Party's control over their information space and financial space and technological space has been near total. And that's just not a level playing field. It's not one that's good for us, but it's also not one good for freedom in general.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Steve. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode on China in Focus, where we sat down with American political advisor and government official Stephen Yates. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.